In a bold move, President Trump targeted Russian oil giants Rosneft and Lukoil with unprecedented sanctions and cancelled his planned summit in Budapest with Russian President Vladimir Putin. With Zelensky rejecting concessions and Europe pressing for further action, the stakes in the Ukraine war are only rising. Now, what comes next in this war, and will these sanctions finally bring Putin to the negotiating table, which is what the ultimate game is? Will that happen at all? I dig a little deeper. US President Donald Trump announced this week that he was imposing significant new sanctions on Russia for the first time in his second term. These sanctions imposed by the Treasury Department are primarily against two Russian oil conglomerates, Rosneft and Lukoil. But the move also underscores a degree of frustration on Trump's part with the Russian President Vladimir Putin after a plan for both leaders to meet in Budapest in Hungary fell apart. The new sanctions were announced just as President Trump sat down in the Oval Office with NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte. Rutte had specially flown down to Washington. There were concerns among a coalition of European leaders who are desperate to ensure that Trump is on the side of Ukraine. Rutte happened to be their chosen messenger.
They're massive sanctions. It's sanctions on oil. The two biggest oil companies, among the biggest in the world, but they're Russian. They do a lot of oil. And hopefully it'll push, hopefully he'll become reasonable, and hopefully Zelensky will be reasonable. A very good relationship.
Trump's irritation with Russian President Vladimir Putin was evident in the joint meeting with Rutte. He explained his decision to cancel the Budapest summit that he had planned for some time in the next couple of weeks. Trump had a 2.5-hour-long phone call with Putin just last week, and the very next day, he met with Zelensky at the White House and cancelled his much-touted plan to sell the Ukrainians with long-range Tomahawk missiles. But now, after Russia's seeming non-cooperation, President Trump has decided to cancel his upcoming summit with President Putin, which was supposed to happen in Budapest in 2 weeks' time. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was also supposed to meet his counterpart, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, this week. That too stands cancelled. Trump explained his decision by saying that something just didn't feel right about the proposed meeting with Putin.
When we canceled the meeting with President Putin, it didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like we were going to get to the place we have to get, so I canceled it. But we'll do it in the future. But next week we'll be with many of you in those locations that I told you. Then it's back to Washington.
The sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil are among the most significant measures that the United States has taken against Russian energy since the beginning of this war in Ukraine. The Biden administration had avoided levying sanctions against these oil companies so that it would allow for legal purchases of Russian oil by American allies, whether in Europe or in other countries. But Trump targeting these companies could make a meaningful dent in Russia's oil revenues. Russia made a total of over $200 billion in its oil and oil product exports in 2024. Rosneft itself made about $12 billion and Lukoil about $10 billion in net income in 2024. But that contribution has fallen substantially in 2025 because of the threat of sanctions and because other countries have moved away from Russian oil. But the key here is going to be enforcement. Secondary sanctions would also target countries that do financial business with Russia. China and India happen to be the two biggest importers of Russian oil. So these set of sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil will likely impact both China and India, and Trump is hoping that that would put pressure on the Kremlin.
I'm absolutely convinced that with sustained pressure, we will be able to get Putin to the table to agree with a ceasefire and then other talks coming after that. And you have seen it in the last couple of weeks. Alaska happened when the American president decided to do secondary sanctions on India buying Russian oil.
Last week, President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine came to the White House to attempt to bring President Trump more firmly onto his side. But behind the scenes, the meeting between Trump and Zelensky did not go down well. This was reported by the Financial Times and by CNN. Trump, in fact, pressured Zelensky in that meeting to concede territory to Russia so that a ceasefire on Putin's terms might come into effect. This was straight out of Putin's playbook, and Zelensky declined. There is now a familiar pattern of behavior when it comes to Trump and Putin. After Trump and Putin got together in Alaska back in August, the American president abandoned his primary goal, which was to secure an immediate ceasefire. Instead, he stuck to the Russian position, which is that Ukraine give up a fifth of its territory and freeze the current battle lines. The Europeans were shocked and they rushed to Washington en masse. The leaders of Britain, France, Germany, Italy were all there just 2 days after that Alaska summit, and they surrounded Trump with a charm offensive. Trump then backed off, but only for just a bit. This same sort of cycle transpired earlier this month with the Europeans, who had grown hopeful that Trump had dangled the possibility that he would supply long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. But then Putin and Trump got together on the phone, there was a long phone conversation, and the supply of Tomahawks was dropped. But Putin seems nonplussed amidst all of this drama. Earlier this week, there was a major attack by Russian forces on a kindergarten school in Kiev. Most of those dead were either children or their parents or teachers. It also coincided with Russia conducting drills on its own territory involving nuclear weapons, including test launches of intercontinental ballistic missiles or ICBMs, which can directly target the continental United States. In fact, this was confirmed according to a statement put out by the Kremlin. Putin was clearly rattling the saber yet again. Moscow has signaled that it is holding out for Ukraine to surrender parts of the eastern Donbass region, which are still under Ukrainian control. That is simply a non-starter for Kiev. European leaders have joined with Ukraine for calling for an immediate ceasefire at the current battle lines. But Russia has entered these talks with America with one primary goal, and that is to delay any ceasefire and to block the United States from providing long-range weapons to Ukraine. While Putin has largely succeeded so far, the cancelled summit in Budapest shows that the Russian president may be losing his ability to rely on the same tactic again and again. Trump is fast losing his patience with Putin. The question is, what is he going to do about it now?